When I asked my sister for $150, she laughed in my face like I'd asked her for a fortune, and in that moment, I felt smaller than I ever had in my life. I still remember the sound of her laughter. It wasn't just a laugh, it was that sharp, ringing kind that feels like glass breaking in the quiet of your own home. I had come to her that morning, timid, wallet half empty, heart a little heavy with pride I didn't want to surrender. "Could you spot me $150?" I had asked, trying to keep my voice light. Just light enough so that it didn't sound like a plea. Instead, she threw back her head and cackled. "$150? Oh, honey, I thought you were joking. That's barely enough for a week of groceries for me." Her tone had that cruel mix of mockery and pity, like she was watching me flounder in slow motion. I wanted to disappear right there on the spot. I nodded, forcing a tight smile. "It's fine. Don't worry about it." My voice trembled, though I didn't want her or anyone to see it. I left her apartment and walked down the street, the wind biting at my cheeks, feeling the familiar sting of shame. That laugh echoed behind me, louder than the city traffic, louder than the car horns, louder than anything else in my day. But that morning when I nursed my bruised pride with a cup of lukewarm coffee at my kitchen table, I didn't know that it was the last time I'd feel powerless for a very long time. I didn't know that $150 was a small, almost laughable number compared to what my life had quietly accumulated over the years, tucked away in a bank account she never knew existed. And certainly, I didn't know that one day, her laughter would freeze in her throat along with every single banker in the room. My life, on the surface, seemed ordinary. I worked at a small investment firm, the kind of place where everyone knew your favorite coffee order and your dog's name. My apartment was modest, filled with plants I couldn't seem to keep alive and books I rarely opened. I liked things simple, predictable. I liked mornings where the toast burned slightly because I was half asleep, and the smell filled the kitchen while I sipped my coffee and stared out the window at the city slowly, waking. My sister Vanessa lived just a few blocks away, and for a long time I had thought of her as the golden child. She was bright, magnetic, always the center of attention, the one everyone seemed to admire without effort. Me? I was quiet, careful, the one who measured words and avoided drama. But we had always been close, or at least, I had believed we were. Before that $150 incident, our interactions were warm on the surface. Holidays were spent laughing over burnt casseroles and too sweet pies. Birthdays were loud and full of family stories that got exaggerated each year. But Vanessa had always had this edge and undercurrent of superiority I ignored, telling myself it was just sibling rivalry. I told myself she loved me, even if her love came with a side of mockery. I had my own life to live. I managed my finances carefully, saved diligently, and stayed out of trouble. I rarely talked about money because it never felt like a topic for small talk. I didn't need to flaunt it. I didn't need to prove anything. But money, like a quiet river, had flowed in my favor over the years. Investments made years ago, stock options forgotten in dusty accounts, careful planning that no one noticed, it added up. To me, it was just security. To others, it was invisible. The morning after Vanessa's laugh, I went about my routine as if nothing had happened. I walked my dog, greeted the neighbors, brewed my coffee, and skimmed through emails. But there was a small seed planted in my mind, the memory of her laughter, sharp and cruel, paired with the memory of that empty feeling in my wallet. A week later, she called me out of the blue. "Hey, can I borrow $50?" she asked. I could hear the casualness in her voice, that same air of entitlement. I paused. The memory of the $150 laughed-at request burned in my chest. I didn't answer immediately. I just listened to her chatter about her new apartment, her promotion at work, the expensive shoes she wanted to buy. I realized then that she had no idea what I actually had. She had no clue that the small, quiet sister she thought she looked down on could, if she wanted, move more money in a day than she could earn in a lifetime. I didn't tell her. I didn't laugh, and I didn't chastise her. I simply made a mental note. Things were changing. It was during this period of quiet reflection that I began to notice the little cracks in our relationship. Vanessa started dropping hints about my supposed frugality, the way I always declined brunches, how I never lived a little. She compared me to friends with flashy cars and designer bags, as if my worth was measured by consumption. At first I ignored it, smiling politely while my stomach tightened. But slowly, the remarks began to sting more sharply than any of her jokes had before. And then came the day of the bank visit, the day that would change everything. I remember walking into the marble-floored lobby, the smell of polished wood and fresh coffee filling the air. The tellers smiled politely, unaware of the storm they were about to witness. My hands were steady, my expression calm, but inside, a quiet satisfaction hummed. This wasn't about money, this wasn't about proving anything to anyone. This was about dignity. This was about showing without a word that I was no one's laughingstock. When I requested the withdrawal 4.2 billion, the reactions were immediate. Eyes widened, phones buzzed, managers came running. I kept my voice soft, measured. "I'd like to access my funds," I said, the sound of my words echoing faintly in the cavernous lobby. Vanessa, if she had been there, would have known instantly the quiet sister, the one she mocked, had been hiding a fortune she never suspected. And I knew, deep down, that her laughter would finally be silenced, not by me raising my voice, but by the reality staring her in the face. I didn't leave the bank that day with a sense of triumph or vengeance. No, it was quieter than that. It was a serene, almost meditative satisfaction. I watched as staff scrambled to verify numbers, as security asked questions, as the air filled with tension and disbelief. The very institution that handled the world's money had frozen in shock over a number that, to me, had always just been security. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew Vanessa would hear about it. She would feel the sharp sting of recognition that she had underestimated me, belittled me, laughed at my need, and that the world she thought she controlled had, in a sense, just reminded her that some things quiet diligence, patience, foresight couldn't be mocked or ignored. But as I left that day, walking past the tellers, past the security guards, past the stunned whispers, I realized something crucial. This story wasn't about showing her up. It was about me. About finally feeling the quiet, unshakable power of knowing my worth. Of knowing that I had carried myself with integrity while the world judged me superficially. And in that quiet reflection, I felt something warm bloom in my chest. Not revenge. Outdrama. I liked it that way. No one called me at midnight with questions. No one tried to pull me into petty office politics. It was a life measured in spreadsheets and careful calculations. And for years, it had suited me perfectly. My sister Vanessa had a very different life. She thrived on chaos, on spectacle. Her apartment was filled with expensive furniture she didn't really need, her social calendar packed with events I would never attend. She loved the limelight, the sound of her own voice carrying in crowded rooms, everyone laughing at her jokes, or at least pretending to. And somehow, I had always loved her for it, or at least I thought I did. We had dinner together one night a few weeks before the infamous 150 request. It was a Thursday, and the smell of garlic and roasting chicken filled her apartment. She had just returned from a business trip, hair glossy and perfectly styled, heels clicking on the hardwood floor. She looked at me over her wine glass and said, "You know, you could live a little more. Stop hoarding all that money for some day that never comes." I smiled politely, but the comment settled in my chest like a stone. I wanted to tell her then and there that I had nothing to prove, that the quiet life I led was by choice, not by necessity, but instead, I nodded, took a bite of chicken, and said nothing. That night, as I walked home in the cool air, I thought about the gap between us, not just in income, though that was widening quietly, imperceptibly, in my favor but in perspective. She measured life by appearance, by attention, by the laughter of others. I measured mine by security, by stability, by knowing I could handle whatever came next without begging, without compromise. And then, a subtle change began. It wasn't dramatic at first. Vanessa started asking questions that felt oddly pointed. "How's work?" she would ask, her tone lighter than usual, but her eyes sharp. "Any new clients?" The question seemed casual, almost friendly, but there was a subtle undercurrent, a probing, a curiosity that hadn't been there before. One morning I received a text from her. "Hey, just wondering, how's the portfolio doing these days? Big numbers?" I froze. The casual tone didn't disguise the implication. She was fishing. She wanted to know. And for a moment I felt that old familiar sting, the one from the 150 request. But this time, I didn't flinch. I didn't feel small. I simply let it sit in the back of my mind, a quiet observation rather than a wound. Life continued, outwardly the same, but tension had begun to creep in. Vanessa started commenting more on small things: my apartment, the car I drove, the fact that I always declined her invitations to flashy brunches or weekend getaways. "You're too careful, you know," she said one evening, stirring her tea slowly. "Life's too short to count pennies." I smiled, nodded, said nothing. Inside, though, I was cataloging. Every word, every gesture, every subtle jab was being stored away, filed in the quiet chambers of my mind. Then came the first real clue that things were shifting in ways I hadn't anticipated. One Saturday, I went to the cafe we sometimes frequented together. She arrived late, hair slightly mussed from the wind, a look of mild frustration in her eyes. "I had to wait for a call from the bank," she said casually, flipping through her phone. I raised an eyebrow. "The bank?" She laughed, a little too loudly. "Just some account stuff, you know, adult life." But her fingers hovered over the screen, quick and restless. Something about her tone didn't sit right with me. I felt it before I could name it, a subtle, nervous energy, a slight defensiveness she wasn't aware she was radiating. We ordered our coffees, sat down, and talked about trivial things: work, mutual friends, the upcoming holidays. But all the while, there was a tension in the air I couldn't ignore. Vanessa's laughter had a brittle edge. Her eyes darted, not maliciously, but with an anxious alertness I had never seen before. That evening, walking home, the city lights reflecting in puddles from an earlier rain, I realized I had started noticing patterns, not just in Vanessa, but in small events around me. Calls from strangers asking strangely specific questions, emails from financial institutions that seemed routine but carried a slightly formal tone I hadn't encountered before. It was like the world was whispering secrets, and for the first time I felt a quiet thrill, not fear, but anticipation. And then, there was the moment that solidified my suspicion. My phone buzzed late one night with a notification, a transfer request, one I had not authorized, for a modest sum from one of my accounts. I froze, staring at the screen, my heart beating a little faster than usual. It was small, insignificant compared to what I had, but it confirmed what I already suspected. Someone had been paying attention. I didn't confront Vanessa immediately. I watched, waited, let the tension build. She didn't know that I knew. She didn't know that her casual jabs, her questions about my portfolio, her subtle mockery, it had all been noticed, cataloged, understood. The week before the bank incident, I noticed another pattern. Vanessa had started borrowing more frequently, not just money, but small favors, things she never asked before. Every request, every small favor, had this undertone of expectation. She assumed I would say yes. She assumed my life revolved around her whims. And in that moment I realized the truth: she had underestimated me. She had never, in all our years, considered that her younger, quieter sister might have been building a life in parallel. A life measured not in showy appearances but in substance. That was the first real clue, the one that signaled to me that the time for quiet observation was nearing its end. I didn't feel anger. Not yet, not really. I felt a simmering calm, a sense of clarity that came from knowing the truth before anyone else did. I had always known my worth, even when Vanessa had mocked me for 150. Now I was beginning to see the power that came from quiet patience, from diligence unnoticed by the world. I went to bed that night with a sense of anticipation, a slow-building certainty that things were about to change, not just for Vanessa, but for the world around me. That quiet life I had cultivated, the discipline, the patience, the foresight, it was all about to speak loudly in a language she could not ignore. And in that quiet anticipation, I found myself smiling, not cruelly, not triumphantly, but with a deep, settled satisfaction. I knew the moment was coming. I just didn't know exactly how the world would react when it did. The days that followed were strange in a way that only tension you can't yet name feels. Vanessa began showing up in places I hadn't invited her, offering casual, coincidental run-ins that were anything but. One afternoon, I ran into her at the small bookstore I liked, the kind with the dusty shelves and the smell of old paper and polished wood. She smiled too brightly, brows raised, and said, "I didn't expect to see you here. Looking for anything in particular?" I shrugged, glancing at the poetry section. "Just browsing," I said softly, my fingers tracing the spine of a worn copy of Frost. She leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice as if confiding a secret. "You know, some people have really impressive portfolios these days. Investments, stocks, things you wouldn't even notice." Her words were casual, almost playful, but the way she said it, the way her eyes flicked toward me and lingered, sent a chill down my spine. She was testing me. She was fishing for information, trying to see what I knew, what I would reveal. I nodded lightly, tucking the book under my arm. "I'm not really into showing off," I said, letting my words drift into the quiet space between us. She laughed lightly, a little too high-pitched, and moved on to browse the cookbooks. That night, I replayed the encounter in my mind. It wasn't anger that rose in me, it was curiosity, a quiet sharpening of focus. For the first time, I began actively paying attention, not just to Vanessa, but to the subtle patterns around her, the late-night texts, the casual questions about my work, the gentle digs at my modest lifestyle. They weren't random, they were calculated. And then came the email. I opened it while sipping my evening tea, the steam curling around my face, filling my senses with warmth. It was from my bank, an automated alert. Routine in wording but unusual in frequency. A small transfer had been initiated from an account I rarely used. The amount wasn't large, barely enough to matter, but the timing was suspicious. I didn't panic. I didn't even feel angry. I felt aware. I sat back in my chair, dog curled on the rug at my feet, and considered the possibilities. The pattern was emerging. Someone had taken an interest in my life in ways that weren't innocent. Someone was probing, testing boundaries, and I knew with a quiet certainty that the person at the center of it all was Vanessa. The following week, the small signs continued. I noticed her watching me more closely when we met in person, her curiosity barely hidden behind a mask of casual conversation. "You've been working so hard," she said one morning over coffee, stirring her drink slowly. "I bet it's paying off, huh? Big returns?" Her words were meant to be light, friendly, teasing. But the truth was clear. She wanted to know. She wanted to understand the scale of what she had mocked just weeks earlier, and for the first time I allowed myself a small, private smile. I didn't respond directly. I let her questions hang in the air, letting her imagination fill in the gaps. That was part of the lesson, I realized quietly to myself. Patience amplifies power. Let the curiosity grow, let the misjudgment fester, and then let the truth arrive at its own, unhurried pace. Then there was the phone call. It came late one night, just as I was about to shut my laptop and prepare for bed. Vanessa's name flashed on the screen. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hey," she said, voice casual. "I was just wondering, could you help me with something?" Her tone was practiced, effortless. But now I could hear the undertone, the unspoken subtext. This wasn't a casual favor. This was a probe. "What do you need?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral, calm. There was a pause. Well, I could use a little help with a transfer, just a small amount." Her words were carefully chosen. 200, she added casually, as if throwing out an insignificant number. I laughed softly, a quiet sound that filled the room with calm. 200? I repeated, letting the incredulity linger in the air. "Is that really what you're worried about?" Her pause this time was longer, more telling. I just thought... She trailed off, caught between casualness and embarrassment. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, fingers tracing the rim of my teacup. "Vanessa," I said softly, carefully, "we've had this conversation before, but I suppose some lessons need to be repeated." I ended the call gently, leaving her words hanging in the digital ether, and I felt it then, the first real thrill of anticipation. The game was no longer about subtle observation. It was about what would happen next when the truth came out. The days blurred together as I observed quietly, letting small interactions accumulate into a clear picture. Vanessa began to overreach, asking increasingly pointed questions about investments, about clients, about the type of returns one could expect from a carefully managed portfolio. Each question, each offhand remark, was a tiny thread that I could pull. A breadcrumb leading me toward the inevitable revelation. One afternoon I caught her scrolling through my social media profiles, not the public ones, mind you, but the subtle ones I maintained for personal friends. Her finger hovered over. Posts about work achievements, charitable donations and travel experiences I had funded quietly. She lingered, paused, and frowned slightly. That small, almost imperceptible reaction told me everything I needed to know. She had no idea, and the curiosity was turning into suspicion. I remember standing by my window that evening, looking out over the city, sunlight slanting across rooftops, and feeling the quiet power of the moment. This wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone, not really. It was about knowing, finally, that her misjudgment, the casual cruelty of laughing at my 150 request, was being matched by her unawareness of what was quietly growing beneath the surface. I made no plans yet, no dramatic moves. I simply observed, catalogued, and allowed the tension to build. Each interaction with Vanessa became a test of patience, a careful exercise in restraint. Her need to understand, her attempts to quantify what she had mocked, only made the eventual revelation more potent. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to notice another pattern. The world around me, bankers, friends, even casual acquaintances, was beginning to respond to the undercurrent of my growing awareness. Emails arrived with unusual frequency, phone calls were subtly more cautious, and casual comments about my financial life were tinged with awe, not derision. I didn't act yet. I didn't need to. The world was preparing itself for the truth, just as I was. Then came the night I first thought about the 4.2 billion. I was sitting in my apartment, warm light spilling from the lamps onto the bookshelves, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background. I held a small notebook in my hands, the pages filled with years of careful records, investments, and quiet accumulation. I traced my finger along the numbers, letting the scope of it sink in. The quiet diligence, the patience, the invisible labor of years, it all added up. And in that quiet moment, I understood something profound. The power I had was not flashy. It was subtle. It was invisible until it wasn't. And when it finally became visible, it would be undeniable. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine Vanessa's face when she realized the scale of what she had mocked. Not just 150, not just casual teasing, but the realization that the sister she had belittled had quietly grown into someone untouchable in ways she couldn't fathom. I smiled, a slow, steady smile. The first clue had been planted, the subtle shifts had begun, and the rest, well, the rest would unfold naturally. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, a day that began like any other, with the smell of coffee drifting through my apartment and the faint hum of the city outside. I had just returned from my morning walk, still wiping dog hair from my sweater, when my phone buzzed with a notification I didn't expect. It was Vanessa, but this time the tone was different, urgent, almost desperate. "Call me when you get a chance. It's important." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Something in her message set my teeth on edge, a quiet alarm bell that I could neither ignore nor dismiss. I called her back immediately, my voice calm, as though nothing in the world could shake me. "Vanessa, what's going on?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. There was a long pause on her end. I could hear her breathing, shallow, uneven. I didn't mean for this to happen," she said finally, voice trembling. I made a mistake. I felt a strange sensation, a mixture of curiosity and dread. The words didn't make sense yet, but the tremor in her voice told me everything I needed to know. "Slow down," I said softly. "Tell me exactly what you mean." Her explanation tumbled out in broken fragments. She had been casually inquiring about my accounts, making little comments, asking just for curiosity's sake. But somehow, her probing had triggered alerts at the bank. Apparently, she had inadvertently set a chain of internal secure. Itty flags in motion, questions about transfers, checks, portfolio balances. Small, innocent questions, she claimed. But to the bank's algorithm, they looked suspicious. They thought someone was attempting unauthorized access. I listened quietly, sipping my tea, feeling a calmness settle over me that I hadn't expected. "So you're telling me," I said slowly, letting the words stretch between us, "that your casual curiosity nearly caused a system-wide freeze at my bank?" "Yes," she almost shouted, panic rising. "I didn't think, I just wanted to know if you were, doing well financially. I didn't mean to, and then it hit me. This was the moment of truth, the first real evidence that Vanessa had not only underestimated me, but had completely misjudged the quiet life I led. The very thing she had mocked, my diligence, my frugality, my quiet accumulation, had become invisible power, and she had unwittingly triggered it. I didn't shout, I didn't accuse, I simply listened, letting the weight of the moment settle between us like the hush before a storm. "Vanessa," I said finally, voice calm but firm, "you mocked me for 150 not long ago. You laughed, made me feel small, made me think maybe I wasn't worth the trouble. Do you remember that?" Her sobs were audible over the line, raw and unrestrained. I know, I shouldn't have. I didn't mean it that way, I swear." I let her words hang in the air. I wanted her to feel the gravity of her actions, not through anger or cruelty, but through awareness. "I have something you don't know," I said softly. "Something you couldn't have imagined." She was silent. I could hear her heart racing, her breaths shallow. I let the silence stretch, the kind of silence that makes people uncomfortable because it's heavy with implication. "I've been managing my finances for years," I continued, quietly, patiently. No one noticed, no one asked, but every dollar, every investment, every careful choice, it all adds up. "Vanessa, I have 4.2 billion in accessible funds." The pause on the other end was like a physical blow. I could hear her intake of breath, the shaking of her hands even over the phone. What? She stammered. 4.2 billion, I repeated, slowly, deliberately. "And because of the questions you asked, the curious little inquiries, the casual mockery, you triggered the bank's security protocols. They froze everything, every account. Staff were panicking, managers were running. It was startling. The sound of her quiet, broken sobs filled the line. I didn't know. I let the moment linger. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to dramatize. The truth itself was dramatic enough. Years of patience, diligence, and quiet intelligence were now visible in a single, undeniable fact. And the sister who had mocked me for being pennywise was now confronted with the scale of my world. "I want you to understand something," I said softly, the calm in my voice deliberate. "This isn't about revenge. It isn't about proving I was right and you were wrong. It's about awareness. You underestimated me, laughed at me, and assumed that the quiet life was powerless. That assumption has consequences." Her voice was barely above a whisper. I'm sorry," she said. I never thought," I interrupted gently. "I know, that's the point. You didn't think, you judged based on appearances. And that's a lesson, Vanessa, one I hope you carry with you." We spoke for hours that night, not in anger, but in the raw exposure of truth. She confessed to her mistakes, admitted the mockery, the curiosity, the assumptions she had made about me, and I, in turn, allowed myself to articulate my feelings, the sting of being belittled, the quiet accumulation of years of work that went unnoticed, the slow simmer of awareness that now had found expression. The most profound moment wasn't when she cried. It was when she finally understood, not just intellectually, but viscerally, the weight of her underestimation. She saw, at last, that the sister she had mocked for asking 150 had quietly grown into someone untouchable in ways she could not imagine. I ended the conversation with a soft, steady line. "Vanessa, the world is full of people who laugh at what they don't understand. You were one of them. But knowing, finally, is part of growing. Let this be your lesson, not your punishment." For the first time, I felt something lift inside me, a release of tension I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. Not vindictive satisfaction, not petty triumph, but something quieter, validation, recognition, and strangely, warmth. Because even in betrayal, even in the sting of mockery, there is a kind of intimacy that comes from truth. The bank's reaction over the next 24 hours was almost surreal. Managers and staff scrambled to verify the numbers. Security protocols froze transactions across multiple departments. Phones rang endlessly. And through it all, I remained calm, composed, a quiet observer of the chaos that had been triggered not by ambition, but by years of unnoticed diligence. I didn't gloat. I didn't call Vanessa to relish the panic. I simply observed, letting the world adjust to the reality it had overlooked for so long. And in that observation, I found something unexpected, a sense of balance, of justice. not served in cruelty, but in the undeniable power of quiet patience and foresight. By the time Vanessa called again, hours later, her voice was trembling not with panic but with comprehension. I see now, she said softly. I misjudged you. Everything. I smiled, gently, feeling the warmth of closure settle in the quiet of my apartment. It's all right, I said. Now you know. And knowing is the first step. That night, I lay in bed with the hum of the city outside, the dog curled beside me, and realized something profound. This story wasn't about money. It wasn't about showing her up or humiliating her. It was about recognition of my worth, of the quiet life I had built, of the patience and care that had gone unnoticed for so long. And perhaps, if the lesson landed where it needed to, it was about teaching her and anyone else who judged too quickly that what's quiet, careful, and patient is often more powerful than anything loud, flashy, or immediate. After that phone call, I knew things had shifted. Vanessa's mockery had dissolved into stunned comprehension, but I also knew that comprehension alone wouldn't fully repair the subtle imbalance that had existed between us for years. The sting of her earlier laughter was gone, replaced by something quieter, the calm satisfaction of awareness. But I wanted to act not out of spite, not out of vengeance, but to ensure that the lessons were internalized and that the world around us understood the scope of what had gone unnoticed for too long. The next morning, I went to the bank again. This time, it was deliberate. The marble floors gleamed under fluorescent lights, tellers smiled politely, and the faint aroma of polished wood and coffee lingered in the air. But today, I wasn't just a client, I was the eye in the storm. I'd like to finalize the transfer, I said, voice measured, calm. No panic, no drama, only quiet authority. The teller blinked, glanced at her manager, and whispered something I couldn't catch. I smiled politely, the kind of smile that doesn't boast but carries quiet power. Security personnel hovered closer than usual, eyes flicking to the digital displays, whispering into radios. I remained calm, sipping from a small paper cup of water I'd grabbed from the counter. My movements were deliberate, measured. Each gesture, each breath, was a signal that the person in front of them was in full control. The transfer itself wasn't just a financial transaction, it was a statement. Every department, every staff member, from the teller to the branch manager, became part of a subtle theater of acknowledgement. I didn't need to speak loudly, didn't need to demand attention. The numbers alone spoke louder than any words could. And through it all, I allowed Vanessa's earlier mockery to echo quietly in my mind, not as anger, but as a quiet reminder of why patience and diligence are often invisible until they matter most. After the transfer was processed, I walked out of the bank with a quiet satisfaction that didn't rely on anyone's reaction. But the ripple effects began immediately. Staff members whispered to each other, emails circulated, calls were made, and somewhere along the line, Vanessa would hear the story in full, and she would understand the gravity of her misjudgment. But I didn't stop there. I realized that the situation presented an opportunity for reflection, for subtle education rather than overt punishment. I reached out to Vanessa again, this time in person. Her apartment smelled of freshly baked bread, her kitchen filled with the warm aroma of roasting vegetables. She looked smaller somehow, less commanding, as if the weight of awareness had shifted the air around her. I wanted to come by, I said softly, stepping inside. Not to lecture, but to ensure that you understand something. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her sweater. I think I do, she said quietly, voice trembling. I nodded, walking slowly into her living room. The city sun streamed through the window, dust motes floating in the warm beams. It's not just about money, Vanessa, I said carefully. It's about recognition, about understanding that not everything visible is the sum of effort. Some things, quiet things, build power slowly, and they often go unnoticed until they can't be ignored. Her eyes welled with tears. I laughed at you. I made you feel small. I never thought. You didn't think, I said gently, sitting across from her. And that's the point. But now you've seen, and you've experienced the reality. That's the lesson. Not humiliation, not revenge. Awareness She nodded, swallowing hard, her lips pressed together. There was no anger in her gaze, only dawning comprehension. I realized then that the act of revelation itself was a form of action, one that didn't require dramatic displays or vindictive gestures. It was precise, elegant, and undeniably effective. After a while, she finally asked the question that had been lingering unspoken. "Why didn't you, rub it in, show off, make me feel bad?" I smiled softly. "Because that would be petty," I said. "The power in patience, in diligence, lies in its quietness. The lesson is far stronger when it comes from understanding, not cruelty." That night, I returned to my apartment, the faint scent of vanilla from a candle lingering in the air. I reflected on the events, the subtle shifts in the atmosphere, the way small actions, questions, curiosity, mockery can ripple far beyond their origin. My own reaction had been deliberate, measured, controlled. I had allowed the world to respond naturally to the quiet force I had cultivated, rather than forcing recognition with theatrics, and I began to notice how Vanessa's behavior subtly shifted in the days that followed. She stopped making casual jabs at my lifestyle. She stopped asking pointed questions about finances. Even our conversations over coffee became quieter, more reflective. She seemed smaller, not in malice but in awareness. And in that quiet, I realized that my actions, the calm, deliberate choices, had been more powerful than any loud confrontation ever could be. But the story wasn't contained to Vanessa alone. News of the bank incident spread quietly at first. A few colleagues, a couple of neighbors, an acquaintance at the investment firm all whispered about the unusual freeze, the unexpected transaction, the sheer scale of the funds involved. I didn't seek attention. CE I had cultivated had spoken for itself, and I realized in a moment of clarity that action, when guided by calm understanding and patience, carries its own dignity. I also took practical steps, of course. Security measures were increased, alerts were adjusted, any remaining vulnerabilities were addressed quietly, professionally. But there was a subtle artistry to it. Every action was deliberate, every step calculated not to flaunt, but to secure, not to intimidate, but to establish boundaries. Vanessa eventually reached out again weeks later. Her voice was quieter, more reflective. "I think I understand now," she said softly. "Not just about the money, about you, about everything." I smiled, the warmth of understanding settling over us like a soft blanket. "That's all I wanted," I said. "Awareness, recognition, understanding that power often hides in quiet diligence, not in loud declarations." And for the first time in years, I felt a complete, unshakable sense of calm. The tension that had defined my relationship with Vanessa, the sting of mockery, the subtle humiliation of casual jabs, the lingering sense of underestimation had dissolved not through confrontation or drama, but through careful, deliberate action, patience, and awareness. That's when I realized a profound truth. The most powerful reactions aren't always the loudest. They're quiet, they're deliberate, they're calm, controlled, and grounded in integrity. And the world, when given space to respond, recognizes that power in its own time. I sat that evening by my window, watching the city lights shimmer across the skyline. The dog lay asleep at my feet, and the faint scent of my tea lingered in the air. I thought about the path we had taken, Vanessa and I, sibling and sister, observer and observered, and I felt a quiet, deep satisfaction. Not revenge, not triumph, just balance, recognition, awareness. And in that moment, I knew that the most profound actions are often invisible at first, subtle ripples that grow quietly until they can no longer be ignored. The world didn't react all at once. It never does. The impact of true power, especially quiet power, is gradual, unfolding like ripples across water. By the morning after the bank incident, I was already aware that the news would travel, but I didn't anticipate just how quickly it would reach those who mattered. I went about my day with my usual routine. The smell of brewed coffee filled the kitchen, and I watched my dog chase a stray sunbeam across the floor. I sipped my tea, scrolling through my emails, when I noticed the subtle shift. Colleagues were unusually cordial, their small smiles carrying a new weight of respect. My assistant, who had always treated me with quiet efficiency, now asked questions with an added layer of attentiveness, as though gauging not only my words but my judgment. And then came the calls. Friends, acquaintances, Even distant colleagues reached out, their tones mixed with disbelief, curiosity, and occasionally, awe. "I heard about the bank freeze," one friend said carefully over the phone. I didn't realize, wow, 4.2 billion? I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "It's true," I said simply. No boast, no flourish, just a calm acknowledgement. The story spread naturally. People who had once glanced over me, who had assumed my quiet demeanor reflected modest means, were now confronted with the undeniable truth. Vanessa's initial embarrassment had turned into cautious acknowledgement. She stopped commenting on my lifestyle, stopped her probing questions. Her previous airs of superiority melted into a quiet, almost reverent understanding. And I watched it unfold, careful to remain composed, letting the truth speak louder than any words I could have offered. Social media played its part too, though I never posted a single update myself. Someone at the bank, or perhaps a colleague, had shared a general story about a high-value transfer and a temporary freeze that had disrupted Norma L operations. The post went viral, not sensationalized, not embellished, but factual enough to elicit awe. Comments ranged from admiration to disbelief, and through it all, the narrative focused on patience, diligence, and quiet power values I embodied for years. Vanessa became a quiet observer in her own right. She didn't want to speak about the event publicly, though I knew she heard the whispers. She didn't need to. People in her social circles had learned something about her assumptions about underestimating others based on appearances. She was facing her own moral consequences, subtle but undeniable. The realization that she had mocked someone now revealed as vastly more capable than she had imagined weighed heavily on her. The most profound moment came during a small neighborhood gathering I attended a week later. Vanessa was there too, seated across the room, trying to maintain casual conversation, but her eyes kept flicking toward me. I noticed how people's behavior had shifted. Neighbors who had once waved politely now lingered, curious about my work, my background, my life. They didn't know the specifics, only that there was a story unfolding they hadn't expected. And in that, I saw the quiet ripple of recognition, the consequence of years of patience and diligence. I spoke sparingly, listened carefully, and let small truths emerge naturally. Someone mentioned banking protocols. I smiled gently, offering a simple observation about diligence and attention to detail. It was enough. The point was made without dramatics. People understood without being told because reality itself carried weight. Vanessa approached me later, standing just outside the small circle of neighbors. Her voice was quiet, careful. I didn't expect people to notice," she said, a trace of awe in her tone. "No one needed to notice," I said softly. "The important thing is that you noticed, that you understand." Her lips pressed together, and she nodded. There was no shame in her face, only awareness. She had learned the lesson I had wanted her to learn, not through humiliation, but through the natural consequences of her own actions. Even at work, the story had reached management. I received subtle acknowledgments from supervisors, quiet congratulations for handling both the situation and the bank interactions with composure. There were no public announcements, no applause, just recognition. The quiet consequences, I realized, were often more profound than loud accolades. People remembered the calm strength, the control, the intelligence displayed under pressure. The most interesting part, though, was Vanessa's social circle. Friends who had once admired her as the sharp, witty, socially dominant sibling began to see cracks in their assumptions, her casual mockery of others, her probing questions, her sense of superiority. These were now contextualized against the backdrop of my quiet power. She wasn't humiliated publicly, but the moral consequence was there. The balance had shifted. Her laughter, once sharp and cutting, had lost its weight. People began to take her words with caution. Even without confrontation, the world had adjusted. It was a lesson in subtle justice. There was no need for dramatic confrontation, for public shaming, for any vindictive acts. The consequences were moral and social, natural in their unfolding. Those who had misjudged me, even inadvertently, were now faced with a recalibrated reality. And Vanessa, perhaps more than anyone, understood that the quiet sister she had mocked had always carried the power to shape consequences without spectacle. I reflected on the experience while sitting in my apartment, the city lights glittering beyond the window, the dog curled at my feet. The consequences had been immediate for Vanessa, quiet, subtle, deeply internalized, and for the world around me, they had been evident through the ripple effect of awareness. People had adjusted their perceptions, their assumptions, their expectations. They had learned, without being taught, that quiet diligence and careful patience often outweigh loud declarations and visible bravado. By the end of the week, the narrative had settled into a quiet hum. Conversations at work, among neighbors, and in casual social encounters had shifted. My name was spoken with respect rather than idle curiosity. Vanessa had stopped her pointed questions, her subtle digs, her casual mockery. And in that silence, in that subtle acknowledgement of change, I felt the profound satisfaction of natural consequence. It was in this period, quietly observing, that I realized a deeper truth. Real consequences aren't always explosive or public. They are internalized, moral, and social. They are the kind of lessons that persist long after the initial moment has passed. And in Vanessa's awareness, in the subtle acknowledgement from the world around me, I recognized the power of patience, of foresight, of quiet strength. Even weeks later, I would occasionally see Vanessa pause in conversation, a fleeting moment of reflection in her eyes. It wasn't shame, it wasn't fear, it was recognition. She had learned that appearances can deceive, that quiet diligence often masks unimaginable strength, and that underestimating someone has its own consequences. And in that, I found a sense of completion. The public consequence was not the chaos at the bank, though that had been dramatic. It was the shift in perception, the subtle recalibration of respect, the moral understanding that grew quietly in those around us. That, I realized, was far more lasting than any momentary spectacle. After the whirlwind of bank alerts, hushed whispers, and shifting perceptions, life slowly returned to a quieter rhythm. Not normal, not exactly, because the world now knew a truth it hadn't before, but calm in the sense of inner peace. The kind that settles when you've finally spoken your story without shouting. Vanessa and I met for dinner a few days later. She suggested it, hesitant, careful, as though testing whether our bond could survive the seismic shift that had taken place. I agreed. I wanted her presence not to be a test of patience, but a space for rebuilding. Her apartment smelled faintly of rosemary and lemon, warm and inviting. She had cooked a modest meal, roasted vegetables, garlic bread, and chicken, echoing one of our dinners weeks prior. The act itself felt like a quiet olive branch. We sat across from each other, plates steaming between us, the soft hum of music playing in the background. "I've been thinking," she began, voice low, "about everything that happened. About me, about how I treated you." I listened quietly. I had learned the value of stillness during this entire ordeal. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. "I laughed at you," she continued, swallowing hard, "mocked you for 150 like it was nothing. I thought you were overly cautious, weak, small. I never realized." Her words trailed off, eyes wet, unguarded. "I know," I said softly, reaching across the table to brush her hand with mine. It was not pity, nor scolding, it was acknowledgement, recognition that the person sitting across from me had finally understood the magnitude of her misjudgment. Her fingers tightened around mine briefly. "I feel different now. I see you differently, and I'm sorry, not just for the money but for the attitude, the assumptions, everything." I nodded, the quiet calm of years of diligence and patience settling into a comforting warmth. "That's enough, Vanessa. It's not about punishment, never was. The lesson, the understanding, that's what matters." For a long time we sat in silence, the smell of roasted garlic and lemon lingering between us. I realized then that healing doesn't always come in dramatic gestures. Sometimes it comes in quiet acknowledgement, in shared meals, in honest words, and in the recognition that someone has changed. We spoke slowly after that, carefully. She shared her regrets, and I shared my feelings, the sting of belittlement, the years of quiet labor unnoticed, the small victories that had gone unseen. There was honesty in our conversation, raw but calm, not dramatic or accusatory. And slowly, piece by piece, we rebuilt a bridge that had been strained by misunderstanding and assumption. Outside of our relationship, life also began to smooth into a new rhythm. The bank incident faded into an anecdote rather than a crisis. Colleagues and acquaintances no longer treated me with casual doubt. There was respect now, subtle and enduring. People began to recognize the value in patience, discretion, and diligence, not because I demanded it, but because reality itself demonstrated it. Vanessa, too, began to shift in ways I hadn't anticipated. She no longer made casual jabs or probing questions. Her demeanor was quieter, more reflective. I saw her pause before speaking, considering her words carefully, aware of the power of assumptions and the consequences of misjudgment. It wasn't forced humility, it was awareness. That, I realized, was the most lasting kind of healing. One evening, as we walked through the park near my apartment, the faint scent of autumn leaves drifting in the cool breeze, she turned to me quietly. "You know," she said, voice almost hesitant, "I never thought that someone could build something so quietly. I always equated visibility with power. I see now that I was wrong." I smiled, feeling the gentle weight of truth settle between us. "It's easy to misjudge," I said softly. "The world often rewards flashiness, but substance, true substance, is quiet. And it's enduring." She nodded, eyes glistening with both reflection and a hint of newfound admiration. I want to be better," she said, "not just with you, but with how I treat people, how I understand them." "That's all anyone can ask for," I said. "Understanding, awareness, the willingness to grow." And in that moment I felt the quiet satisfaction of resolution. Not triumph, not revenge, not a loud declaration of victory, but calm acknowledgement that the lessons had landed, the misjudgments had been corrected, and the bond between us had been cautiously, gently repaired. In the following weeks, our interactions settled into a new rhythm. We spoke openly about our work, our lives, and our ambitions, but without the shadows of previous mockery. Vanessa became a more careful, reflective version of herself, not diminished, not embarrassed, but more aware. And I, in turn, found joy in observing her growth, in recognizing that patience and calm influence can foster genuine change. Even at work, the residual effects of the bank incident continued subtly. I noticed colleagues treating interactions with more respect, more attentiveness. The lesson was internalized not through coercion or spectacle, but by the undeniable reality of what had occurred. Quiet diligence, when unrecognized for years, has a way of asserting itself that is impossible to ignore once it manifests. At home, I returned to my routines with a renewed sense of calm. Morning coffee, the hum of the city, the soft warmth of my dog curling at my feet. It all felt richer somehow, imbued with the knowledge that my life's choices, my patient accumulation, had finally spoken in a language the world could not misunderstand. One evening I reflected on the lessons learned, the subtle transformations, and the enduring sense of balance that had emerged. Life had shifted, yes, but in a way that felt organic, measured, and profoundly satisfying. I realized that healing, like power, often comes quietly. It is earned through patience, nurtured through reflection, and solidified through understanding. And Vanessa, she had learned not through humiliation or anger, but through the natural consequences of awareness. She had faced her misjudgment, absorbed the lessons, and slowly, subtly adjusted her perspective. That, I thought, was the truest form of resolution, not theatrical reconciliatio, but measured, thoughtful growth. As autumn gave way to winter, I watched her from across the room one evening, her laughter gentle, not cutting, her words careful, not sharp, and I felt warmth, quiet, steady warmth, knowing that both of us had emerged from the storm of misunderstanding with deeper awareness, mutual respect, and a bond rebuilt on honesty rather than assumption. Sitting here, reflecting on everything that unfolded, I realized that life has a way of teaching lessons quietly, without fanfare, without the need for dramatic declarations. The bank, the billions, the mockery. They were all part of a story about awareness, patience, and the subtle power that often hides in the corners of everyday life. Vanessa and I, we both emerged different, not perfect, not unscathed, but wiser. She learned that underestimating someone based on appearances or assumptions carries consequences, even if those consequences are quiet, subtle, and not immediately visible. I learned once again that calm, deliberate action is far more potent than reaction fueled by anger or pride. I think about the moments when we laughed, the moments when we hesitated, the moments when small gestures carried meaning far beyond what anyone could see. That is the truth of human relationships. What is unseen often shapes our lives more than what is visible. My quiet work, my patience, my diligence, it all added up to something undeniable, something the world had to recognize. And it did, in its own time, in its own way. There is a lesson here for all of us, not just about money or family, but about how we perceive the people around us. How often do we mock, underestimate, or dismiss someone simply because their power isn't immediately obvious? How often do we fail to see the careful, patient work that forms the foundation of someone's life? Vanessa's story, our story, is a gentle but firm reminder. Look closely, listen carefully, and never assume that quiet equals weak. I also want to reflect on forgiveness, not in a naive sense, but in the understanding that people can learn and grow when given the chance. Vanessa faced her own moral and social consequences, and she chose awareness over denial. She chose to listen, reflect, and change. That perhaps is the most powerful kind of closure we can ever hope for. As for me, I continue to live quietly, carefully, and with awareness of the strength I hold, not flaunting it, not hiding it, simply letting it exist, and letting the world adjust to it. The ripple effects of diligence, patience, and integrity extend far beyond the immediate moment, and when the lessons are learned, the consequences are lasting. So, I leave you with this gentle question. How often do we misjudge those who are quiet, who ask small questions, who appear modest in their means or in their actions? And if you realized the true strength of someone you underestimated, how would it change your perspective? Life has a way of humbling us, not with grand gestures, but with quiet truths that accumulate until they can no longer be ignored. My story with Vanessa is one of misjudgment, realization, and ultimately reflection. It reminds me, and I hope it reminds you, that awareness, patience, and quiet strength are more powerful than mockery or haste. Would you have handled it differently? Could you have waited, watched, and allowed the truth to reveal itself? Think about that, and let it guide you the next time you underestimate someone or something in your life. And if this story spoke to you, if it gave you a moment of reflection or understanding, consider subscribing and following along for more stories that explore the quiet, complex, and often unseen truths of human relationships. Life teaches in subtle ways, and sometimes it is the quietest voices that carry the loudest lessons.